Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are reviewing Michael Crichton's Sphere, the second book of this little triple combination thing that I've got going on in here. Meeting again for another Crichton review, and well, let's just say that I thought that my last time covering Michael Crichton on this channel was a lot more recently than it was. I thought that the last time I covered him was actually super recently on the channel. It was, in fact, not that. Similar to next week's video, we are going to be discovering that the last time that I did something like this was an entire year ago. It has been a year since I reviewed Congo, which is weird. Like, it just goes to show just how insane and crazy and messed up my 2025 was, because, yeah, it doesn't feel like it's been an entire year since I reviewed Congo. But anyway, I did recently, finally this year, at the very start of the year, read Sphere, one of Crichton's more acclaimed works alongside things like Congo. Do I think that it is deserving? Do I think that Sphere is worth being one of Crichton's more acclaimed works, or do I not? Well, let's find out what I think about the book and start with the good of Sphere. Probably the main thing that I do want to shout out right at the start is actually the way that the book starts. I do think that Sphere is a very close second place as far as Crichton's book intros go. I do think that Congo is Crichton's best example of characters as a whole and general plot setup, just the way that it introduces certain ideas and tensions and just goes along and follows along with that from character perspectives. I do think it is generally more solid start. But Sphere is itself a very intriguing and great introductory work that relies on certain familiar premises and ideas and makes them tense, makes them just immediately like, okay, I can see what the ramifications of this thing are immediately. You know, Congo works on being mysterious in the sense of like, okay, we're trying to figure out what's going on in the first place. Sphere is like, we have something that's going on, we just don't understand how it's possible. And so they're revolved around different types of mystery, different types of intrigue, different types of setting up certain tensions. And overall, I think that these two books are actually Crichton's strongest. Like I said, I think Congo is the best one, but Sphere is a pretty close second in that regard up to this point. I do think that the overall mysterious premise and the conceit of it is introduced and wheedled out over the first couple parts of it in tidbits in really great ways. And that kind of goes on to my next point, and that is not just that the character introductions of part one, I think, are arguably Crichton's best character introductions in that sense, but part two takes those characters and the general premise and develops the mystery and revolved around all of that and utilizes some really great twisting dynamics to make the reader's understanding of the story just really, really unpredictable. You know, Congo is a book that, like, once you do understand what it's trying to do and where it's going, you're following along that, and like it totally makes sense. You know, like, there are still going to be some developments that change some things here and there, particularly with regard to basically going from Acts 2 to 3 of that book. But Sphere is a book that constantly changes. It is very, very frequently keeping you on your toes as a reader. There are many times where the what's going on question here seems to change. You have the initial premise of just like, okay, we have an idea of what's going on, we don't know how it's possible though, and trying to figure out what makes it possible and why it makes sense or not definitely changes a lot throughout the book. I don't know if that makes any sense, but the main point is that Sphere has a lot of moments of a little detail or a particular reveal dramatically shifting how you interpret the entire situation just completely. And I think that throughout part two, as the characters are working through all of that, it's just a really, really great developing story in that sense. You know, I love how the early parts of the books, you know, those parts 1 and 2, kind of flip back and forth between certain different types of tropes and familiar aspects to them. I think that there's, you know, the spoilery part of what makes Project Hail Mary so good. There's an aspect of that kind of bleeds through a lot of this book in ways that I think are really, really kind of fun and interesting, having read this after having already read Project Hail Mary. There's also a lot of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea DNA in here alongside for pretty obvious reasons. In general, I do think that Sphere has a much wider breadth of sci-fi ideas on display compared to a lot of Crichton's previous books, and I think that that makes it really engaging intellectually in some sense. You know, you have stuff like the Andromeda Strain, which does go over a lot of different stuff, but a lot of it is like you know the sci-fi realm that it is handling, and it works well for that. And Congo is a little bit more loosely science fiction, where it's more of like a general scientific study type of thing rather than like the science being a thing, whereas Sphere kind of like combines that a little bit. And like I said, there's a broader swath of different sci-fi influences that are coming through here, various different subgenres of the genre, so to speak, that makes the twists and the way that it shifts your entire perspective on the story kind of a mesmerizing experience. Again, I have absolutely no idea if any of this is making sense. Trying to talk about it without spoiling the book is actually quite difficult, but yeah, it is pretty enjoyable for all of that stuff. But not only do I think that Sphere is solid from the plot developments on that point, I also do have to commend Crichton on Sphere for generally being one of his better characterization books. You know, I do think that Crichton's characters are generally somewhat flat as a whole between all of the books that I've read of his. I think that's generally a pretty solid like critique of him as an author, is that his character work is like serviceable basically, but never truly fantastic. I think Congo is the closest that Crichton has gotten to having fantastic characters of the books that I've read in the last handful of years anyway. But a lot of that is also because there's dynamics between human characters and, apes that kind of allow for that particular dynamic to shine through and be interesting in a different way, whereas Sphere does handle. Sphere does actually come to think of it have a somewhat similar dynamic part of the time, but to explain why would be spoilers, so I'm not going to say why. But in general, Crichton's human characters in Sphere are also pretty good, actually. I do think that they are genuinely solid. You know, his characters as a rule have a bad habit, a bad tendency of like having their role, the thing that they do, the type of scientist that they are or whatever, and that like that role informing how they behave and what kind of person they are. As a general rule, you have like very particular characteristics of these people that are just like, okay, this person is like this, and then that's just the person. And you don't get to flesh that out a little bit. Sphere, where I do think that the characterization of, or rather character interactions, are most interesting in Congo, I do think that Sphere arguably has his best characters up to this point, because I have been reading his books basically more or less in published order. Eaters of the Dead comes out before Congo or Sphere, but I'm reading it after, but you get the general point. I'm reading these in basically published order, and his characters have been improving. Congo's had pretty solid characters overall. Sphere also has pretty solid characters. And I do think that notably one of the best parts about the characters is that they're not all just motivated by what they do. You know, like I said, it's not just their scientific role, the thing that they do that informs how they behave. They have a thing that they do, and it does inform how they behave to some extent, but they also have some personal characteristics that inform the way that they go about that work as well. It actually becomes a little bit more of a two-way street in Sphere compared to previous books, so I do think that that is a solid reason to read this, as opposed to some of his other stories. And related to characters as well, I do think that the tension of character drama in the book, the way that things develop with that for most of the book, is quite good. But I do say most of the book quite specifically because the bad of Sphere is that there's, you know, quite frankly, a lot of it is relegated to like the end of part 3 and most of part 4, quite frankly. And part of that is from a character dynamic, because there are... How do I talk about any of this without spoiling the book? It's actually quite difficult this time around. I do think that there is a degree to which the dramatic shifts of focus, both from a sort of subgenre perspective, but also from a character perspective, general plot development perspective, there's a degree to which it is all really, really cool and super effective. But like I said, there comes a point in the back half of the book, the end of part 3 basically, and part 4. So I guess maybe like the last quarter of it, maybe the last third at most, where the book definitely hits a point where these really big changes and whatnot start to wear out their welcome just a little bit. The book hits a point where it becomes a little bit overutilized as a whole, where the effect of some of the final reveals of the book, while they should be the most dramatic of the book, are pretty underwhelming because we've already gone through so many shifts. It's like, okay, why are we doing this again? Where I don't think it's that much of a problem. It didn't hurt my experience that much. I do just think that it's a little bit too much for how short the book is. You know, if this was a book that was like, I don't know, like, as far as a general page count goes, we'll say, like, in relativity, if it was like a 500 to 600 page book instead of a 300 to 400 page book, it would work a lot better for these shifts because you would have more space for some of it to settle in and then for tension to build again before the next drop happens. Some of the drops near the end of Sphere as it exists right now are perhaps a little bit random. They feel a little bit more random, or rather, they feel slightly less deserved than a lot of the reveals through parts 1 and 2 do, I think is the way that I'll put it. You know, I think that some of the ways that Crichton also explains some of it gets a little bit heavy-handed. So, yeah, that's like the biggest critique of the book, is that the general rising action, the final rising action into the climax and the climax itself are pretty good, but then you have a certain reveal that's just like, okay, I think we've taken this a step too far. I don't know that this was necessarily the direction that we needed to go here. It might just be a personal taste thing, but you never know. The other thing that I do want to call out for the bad of the book is that I do think that the resolution actually kind of follows a similar trend as the way that some of the general plot developments do as well. I think that the way that things are forced to go back to normal at the very end of the book, as far as like the real resolution, actually works overall, and there's not much other way that Crichton could have actually handled that particular aspect, and the book makes sense. So it works overall, it makes sense, but it's also like a bit cheesy. You know, it's definitely a huge suspension of disbelief, and that combines with the overall climax, like the final reveal of part 3. That's just like, okay, I think we might have stepped a little bit too far with this one, Michael. But, you know, it's not awful. It's just that there's a few too many twists, and all those twists are trying to one-up the previous one for obvious reasons. Some of the inherent tension that I think the book does so good building, especially in parts 1 and 2 and like the first half of part 3, a little bit of it is lost for me in the end because of that. I don't hate it. I don't hate all of it, but there's enough issue that I take with some of that in the final act of the book that I was left a little bit disappointed in some respects, we'll say. And that's actually a pretty good segue into the ugly for Sphere, and that is because with reading Sphere, I realize what it is, the exact kind of role that Michael Crichton actually fills in my life as a reader. And it's not as pretty of a role as I thought at first, or as I would necessarily like, if that makes sense. I do think that Crichton's work fills a particular place in the palate cleanser space that is super effective and works really well. You know, there's a sort of hard sci-fi edge to certain things, but it's also a techno thriller, so it's really, really fast paced. You know, the way that all of this comes together means that the books tend to be pretty quick and also surprisingly simple reads despite the hard sci-fi edge. So you like get like just a particular conglomeration of approach to storytelling that works for being conducive to quick reading and that kind of thing. But you also have certain other things going on, like characters generally not being super sophisticated. This often, you know, allows for the plot to move pretty well, but it's also means there's a slight lack of connection that could otherwise be there. Michael Crichton's prose is also not phenomenal. It's not bad. It is perfectly tailored to convey necessary information with that sort of hard sci-fi edge, like I said, that is like really great for serving that purpose, but it also means that you're not really getting much of anything beyond that. It's serviceable, basically. It's serviceable for what it's doing and effective for what it's doing, but you can't help but wish there was a little bit more to it. And also, this just means that as a whole, Michael Crichton's books have, at least in the last handful of years, they've never really hit a spot of being favorites. Like, I've really enjoyed all of them, but I love Crichton as an author more than I actually enjoy any of his works. And Sphere is when it became super obvious to me that while I can easily enjoy these books, I don't really ever find myself loving them. It feels half a shame that this is the case, you know? I also have no plans to stop reading his work on account of all of this. They're too good not to, but they're also like not as great as you kind of wish for them to be. It's a really weird place to be in where, like, I enjoy this thing. The brand of palate cleanser that they are is something that nobody else really does. I haven't read any of Blake Crouch's supposed techno thriller stuff, to be fair, but the point remains. The way that Crichton wrote stories, the way that he explored certain scientific ideas, the way that he explored technology, and the very iconic idea from Jurassic Park of, well, you got to thinking so much about the fact that you never stopped to think whether you should, and that being a big point of what he does with a lot of his books. It's all really cool. It's really great. So I love him as an author for those reasons, and for the way that his books fill a particular role in the palate cleanser space, like I said before. But I also wish that they did more, because Congo and Sphere are amongst his most acclaimed books, and both of them have major issues. Both of them have certain things about them that are disappointing. But that is going to take us into the recommendation of Sphere, I guess, and that is because I do think that if you want one of Crichton's better novels with some familiar sci-fi ideas that kind of go back and forth between them in ways that I think are super fun and engaging, you should try out Sphere as a whole, especially since many of those familiar ideas evolve and change throughout them, you know? But as a whole, even though I recommend Sphere, it also kind of reminds me of the fact that I don't particularly recommend most of his books at this point, or rather, technically I do, but, you know, of the 5 of his books that I've read since 2021, I recommend 3 of them, but I don't like highly recommend any of those 3, if that makes sense. I recommend The Andromeda Strain because it is a really great experimental piece, and the type of scientific work that is being done on it is honestly really good, despite the characters being pretty big nothing burgers. I don't particularly recommend The Terminal Man or The Great Train Robbery. They're fine books, but there's no reason why you need to read them unless you intend to read all of Crichton. Congo I generally recommend because I think it is a fantastic book for the first like 3/4 of it. It's just that the end is not good because it stops in the middle of the climax and then the resolution is really underbaked. So like, as long as you go into Congo knowing that there's basically no ending, that its ending sucks because it's just, there's a lot that's not there. The rest of that book is pretty fantastic, actually. And then I generally recommend Sphere because I do think it has a pretty great dynamic exploration of some really cool ideas, despite some of its messiness. But you'll notice that, like, even of the 3 Crichton books that I recommend, they have pretty big asterisks next to them. Andromeda Strain, nothing burger characters. Congo, abysmal ending. Sphere, a lot of messiness in the final act. I wish I could do more about recommending Crichton. I wish I could do more about recommending this book, but you know, a lot of that's all just like personal qualms and stuff like that. Overall, I think that this is going to be the end of the review. I'm sorry for rambling, and I'm not sure that I actually made any of my point go across, and I probably made this book sound a lot worse than it actually is. It's a great book. I rated it 4 stars. It's just that I wish I wanted this to be 5 stars. At the offset, it was like, this has big 5-star potential. It's the same thing with Congo, where I think Congo is 5 stars, except for the ending. Big asterisk next to everything that Crichton has done that I've read so far. But I still plan to read more of his books. You know, I plan to read Eaters of the Dead pretty soon, so that I'm through both of these triple combinations that I own relatively soon, you know, like this year. But after I've read Eaters of the Dead, I'm not sure when I'm going to read my next Crichton book at that point. Like, it's just kind of unfortunate. I wish there was a little bit more that I was getting out of Crichton, all things considered. But with all that being said, of any of this man's books that you've potentially read, if you have read very many of them at all. Which one is your favorite and why? I'm curious to know, because at this point, of those 5 books, Andromeda Strain, Terminal Man, Great Train Robbery, Congo, and Sphere, I think Congo is my favorite. Sphere is a close second, even though it did pretty heavily disappoint me in some ways. But yeah, with all that being said, that is the end of this video. Definitely went on longer than I intended, but I appreciate you for watching if you did. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.